Snow doesn't just fall, it erases, it buries mistakes, swallows screams, and freezes the very veins of fools who trust the wrong men. Out here, in the unforgiving Wyoming territory, a blizzard is a death sentence handed down by God himself. But sometimes survival isn't about fighting the cold. It's about colliding with something far wilder than the storm. A man carved from the very mountain she was left to die on. A man who refuses to let her freeze. Wood splintered as Orson hurled her through the doorframe. Carmela hit the frozen mud of the porch on her knees, the impact sending a jarring spike of pain straight up her spine. The wind caught her immediately. It was not a breeze. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of freezing air that knocked the remaining breath from her lungs. She scrambled to turn around, her bare palms scraping against rough-hewn pine boards. Orson stood in the doorway. He held a kerosene lantern in one hand, the yellow light casting long, grotesque shadows across his sharp, unforgiving face. He didn't look angry. That was the worst part. He looked utterly bored. "I told you, Carmela," Orson said, his voice carrying easily over the rising howl of the wind. "I don't tolerate dead weight. You eat my food, you take up space, and you can't even keep your mouth shut when I'm handling my business." She tried to speak, but her throat clamped shut. The sheer drop in temperature was already shocking her system. She wore only a faded cotton dress and a thin wool shawl she had managed to grab before he dragged her by the hair toward the exit. It was November in the high country. The sky had been threatening snow for 3 days, a heavy iron-grey ceiling pressing down on the pines. Now the threat was a reality. The flakes were small, hard, and flying sideways, stinging her exposed skin like buckshot. "Orson, please." Her voice was a pathetic croak. She hated herself for the tremor in it. She had promised herself she wouldn't beg. Not to him. Not to a man who had lied his way into her life and systematically stripped her of everything she owned. "It's 20 degrees. I won't make it to town." "Then don't go to town." He stepped back, moving into the warm, golden interior of the cabin. The smell of burning hickory and roasting meat drifted out, mocking her. "Maybe someone will find you in the spring melt." He slammed the door. The heavy thud echoed for a fraction of a second before the wind swallowed it whole. Carmela heard the thick iron bolt slide into place. Click. The sound of her death warrant being sealed. She stayed on her knees for a long minute. Shock held her pinned. The cynical part of her mind, the part that had watched her father drink himself to death and her mother work her fingers to the bone for nothing, simply nodded. Of course it ended like this. Men like Orson didn't change. They didn't have sudden epiphanies of morality. They took what they wanted, and when they were bored, they threw the remnants out into the trash. In this case, the trash was a blinding squall in the middle of nowhere. Pain flared in her fingers. They were already going numb, the skin turning a mottled red. Carmela forced herself to stand. Her legs trembled violently. The cold was a parasite, burrowing through the thin cotton of her dress, sinking its teeth into her muscles. She wrapped the inadequate shawl tightly around her shoulders, crossing her arms over her chest, and turned her back to the cabin. There was no point in pounding on the door. Orson wouldn't open it. He was probably already sitting by the hearth, pouring a glass of the rye whiskey he'd bought with her inherited savings. She looked out into the void. The world had shrunk to a radius of about 10 feet. Beyond that, it was the swirling, chaotic vortex of white. The nearest settlement, a rough-and-tumble mining camp, was 5 miles down the mountain trail. In good weather, it was a treacherous 2-hour walk. In this, it was impossible, but staying meant freezing on the porch. Walking meant freezing somewhere else. She chose walking. It gave her the illusion of control. Carmela stepped off the porch. The snow was already ankle-deep, drifting rapidly. Her boots were worn, the leather cracked. The cold seeped through the soles instantly. She oriented herself by the faint outline of the tree line on her right. Keep the trees to the right. That was the trail. Every step was an exertion. The wind fought her, pushing against her chest, trying to knock her backward. She kept her head down, chin tucked to her collarbone, eyes narrowed to slits against the flying ice. She thought about her mistakes, not with regret. Regret was a useless luxury right now, but with a cold, hard clarity. Trusting Orson, leaving the city, believing that a fresh start in the West meant anything other than finding new ways to suffer. It was all so agonizingly predictable. She had traded the stifling, smog-choked poverty of the East for the clean, vast, lethal emptiness of the frontier. A heavy gust caught her off guard. Carmela stumbled, her boot catching on a hidden root. She went down hard, plunging face first into a snowdrift. The shock of the cold against her face was blinding. She gasped, inhaling a lungful of icy powder that sent her into a violent coughing fit. "Get up!" The thought was sluggish. Her brain felt slow, as if the cold was thickening her blood, slowing the synapses. She pushed herself up, her hands sinking deep into the snow. Her fingers were no longer red. They were a terrible waxy white. She couldn't feel them at all. She stood. The tree line was gone. Carmela spun around in a panic. White. Nothing but white. The wind roared, a deafening, continuous scream that filled her ears and drowned out her own panicked breathing. Which way was down? Which way was the trail? The landscape had been erased. She picked a direction and started walking. It didn't matter anymore. The game was up. She was just playing out the final minutes. Time lost its meaning. It could have been 10 minutes or 2 hours. The blizzard was an ocean, and Carmela was drowning in it. The shivering had stopped. That was bad. She remembered reading that somewhere, or maybe someone had told her. When you stop shivering, your body has given up trying to generate heat. It is conserving energy for the vital organs, writing off the limbs as a lost cause. Her legs moved mechanically, dragging through snow that was now up to her knees. She felt strangely detached from her own body. The agonizing, biting pain of the cold had faded into a dull, heavy ache. And now, even that was receding, replaced by an odd, floating sensation. Her mind wandered. She saw her mother's kitchen back in Boston, the warmth of the cast-iron stove, the smell of baking bread. She reached out to touch the stove. Her hand hit the rough bark of a pine tree. Carmela blinked, the hallucination shattering. She leaned against the trunk, gasping. Her eyelashes were frozen together, forming a heavy, crusty visor over her eyes. She reached up with a clumsy, block-like hand and rubbed her eyes, scraping the ice away. The wind shrieked through the pine boughs above her. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched wail that seemed to vibrate in her teeth. She looked down at her dress. It was frozen stiff, a rigid shell of ice that cracked audibly when she moved. "Keep going," she whispered. The sound was snatched from her lips instantly. She pushed away from the tree. Her right leg simply didn't respond. It gave out, and she collapsed into the snow. She didn't try to catch herself. The impact was muffled, soft. She lay on her side, the snow quickly building up around her. It felt remarkably comfortable. A deep, profound exhaustion washed over her. It was a bone-deep weariness, a desperate need to just close her eyes and sleep. The cynicism flared one last time. "You're dying, Carmela. Don't be an idiot. Get up." But her body refused the command. The muscles were locked, the joints frozen. She stared at the swirling flakes inches from her face. They were beautiful, in a cruel, indifferent sort of way. Each one unique, each one a tiny weapon contributing to her execution. She thought of Orson again. He would get away with it. He would tell the sheriff she ran off in a fit of hysteria. No one would question it. Women broke in this country all the time. The land chewed them up and spit them out. She was just another statistic, another unmarked grave in the spring thaw. A strange warmth began to spread through her chest. It was a false heat, a symptom of the final stages of hypothermia, but she didn't care. It felt good. The panic was gone. The anger was gone. There was only the white, the wind, and the sleep. She closed her eyes. The roar of the blizzard began to sound like a lullaby. Then the ground vibrated. It was faint at first, a rhythmic thudding beneath the howling wind. Carmela ignored it. She was too far gone to care. But the vibration grew stronger, closer. Something blocked the wind. The sudden absence of the gale hitting her face was shocking enough to force her eyes open. Through the crust of ice on her lashes, she saw a shape. It was massive. At first, her delirious mind registered it as a bear. It was a towering, dark silhouette against the whiteout, draped in thick, snow-caked furs. But bears were asleep this time of year. And bears didn't wear wide-brimmed hats pulled low over their faces. The shape knelt. A hand roughly brushed the snow from her face. The glove was heavy leather, lined with fur. Hell of a day for a stroll. The voice was a low, gravelly rumble. It didn't belong to Orson. It didn't belong to anyone she knew. It sounded like two stones grinding together. Carmela tried to speak, to ask for help, but her jaw was locked shut. Her lips were blue and cracked. The man didn't wait for a response. He slid one massive arm under her knees and the other behind her back. He stood up, lifting her as effortlessly as if she were a bundle of kindling. The sudden movement made Carmela dizzy. Her head rolled back, coming to rest against a chest that felt as solid as a granite wall. She smelled wood smoke, old leather, and a faint, sharp scent of pine needles. He adjusted his grip, pulling her tight against his body. The heat radiating from him was astonishing. It was a fierce, living heat that immediately began to wage war against the ice in her clothes. He turned and began to walk. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. He carved through the waist-deep drifts with a slow, relentless power, a machine built for this exact environment. Carmela watched the snow swirling around his broad shoulders. The exhaustion finally took her. She didn't know if she was being saved or just carried to a different grave, but she lacked the energy to care. She let the darkness pull her under. Heat. Searing, agonizing heat. Carmela groaned, trying to thrash away from the pain, but her body felt leaden. Her nerves, previously deadened by the cold, were screaming back to life. It felt like her skin was being pricked by 1,000 burning needles. She opened her eyes. The light was dim, flickering and orange. She was staring at a ceiling made of thick, unpeeled logs. The smell of wood smoke was overpowering, mixed with the rich scent of brewing coffee and something savory roasting. Panic hit her late, a sudden breathless spike in her chest. Where was she? Where was Orson? She tried to sit up and failed. She was buried under a mountain of weight. She looked down. 3 heavy wolf-hide blankets covered her, piled high. Beneath them, she realized with a jolt of alarm, she was entirely naked. Her dress, her shawl, her undergarments, they were gone. Don't move. The voice came from the corner of the room. It was the same gravelly rumble from the snow. Carmela turned her head. The cabin was small, consisting of a single room. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, roaring with a massive log fire. The heat in the room was stifling, almost oppressive. He sat in a heavy wooden chair near the hearth. He was carving a piece of pine with a hunting knife, his movements precise and economic. He was huge. That hadn't been an illusion of the storm. Even sitting down, his shoulders were impossibly broad, straining the seams of his faded, heavy flannel shirt. His legs, clad in dark, durable canvas trousers, stretched out towards the fire. His face was weathered, deeply tanned, and lined by years of sun and wind. A thick dark beard covered his jaw, and his hair, dark with a few streaks of silver, fell to his collar. But it was his eyes that caught her. When he looked up from his carving, they locked onto hers. They were a pale, startling grey. They weren't kind exactly, but they were steady, grounded. There was no cruelty in them, just a quiet, calculating observation. "My clothes," Carmela rasped. Her throat felt like sandpaper. He pointed the tip of his knife toward a wooden rack near the fire. Her dress and undergarments hung there, dripping onto the stone hearth. "Frozen solid," he said, returning to his carving. "Had to thaw you out. You leave wet clothes on a frozen body, you just freeze 'em faster. Basic science." He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded pragmatic. Carmela pulled the heavy hides tighter to her chin, her knuckles white. The pain in her extremities was excruciating. "My hands and feet, thawing," he interrupted. "It's gonna hurt like hell. Means you aren't gonna lose them. If it stopped hurting, we'd have a problem." He stood up, sheathing the knife in a worn leather scabbard on his belt. He walked over to a cast-iron stove in the corner, picked up a battered tin mug, and poured coffee from a blackened pot. He walked to the edge of the bed and held it out. "Drink." Carmela hesitated. She looked from the mug to his face. Trust didn't come easy anymore. Actually, trust didn't come at all. He read her expression. A faint, humorless smirk touched the corner of his mouth beneath the beard. "Lady, if I wanted you dead, I would have left you in the snow. Save me the coffee. Drink it." She reached out with a trembling hand from beneath the furs. Her fingers were bright red and swollen, throbbing with every heartbeat. She managed to grip the mug. The heat of the tin seared her palm, but she welcomed it. She brought it to her lips and took a sip. It was black, bitter, and strong enough to strip paint, but it was hot. It sent a trail of fire down her esophagus. "Thank you," she managed to say. He grunted, pulling up a wooden stool and sitting a few feet from the bed. He watched her drink. It wasn't a leering look. It was the look of a rancher assessing a sick calf. "Name's Will," he said finally. "Will Boone." "Carmela." She swallowed hard. "Carmela Rivera." "Well, Carmela Rivera, what possesses a woman to take a walk in a whiteout in a cotton dress? You simple or just suicidal?" The bluntness of the question hit her like a slap. The memory of Orson throwing her out, the utter helplessness she had felt, rushed back, bringing a sudden, hot sting of tears to her eyes. She blinked them back furiously. She wouldn't cry. Not in front of this stranger, not ever again. "I didn't take a walk," she said, her voice turning brittle. "I was put out." Will's grey eyes narrowed slightly. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers on his knee stopped. "Put out. The man I was staying with, down in the valley. We had a disagreement." He locked the door. Silence stretched in the cabin, broken only by the crackle and pop of the fire. Will didn't ask what the disagreement was. He didn't ask if she had provoked it. He just stared at the fire for a long moment, his jaw tightening beneath the thick beard. When he looked back at her, the neutrality in his gaze was gone. It was replaced by something hard, something dangerous. "Man who locks a woman out in a squall ain't a man," Will said softly. The gravel in his voice had smoothed out into something lethal. "He's a dog that needs putting down." Carmela gripped the tin mug tighter. "He's dangerous. You don't know him." Will leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on his knees. He looked directly into her eyes, holding her gaze with a gravity that made her breath hitch. He wasn't Orson. He wasn't a city man playing at being tough. The danger in this man was real, buried deep in his bones, forged by the wilderness outside the door. "I don't need to know him," Will said, his voice a low, steady vow that seemed to echo off the log walls. "You're in my cabin now, Carmela. No one hurts you again." Sunlight didn't penetrate the cabin. The only measure of time passing was the woodpile shrinking and the coffee pot emptying. Carmela spent the next 2 days trapped in a haze of agony. The thawing process Will had warned her about was worse than the freezing. Her fingers and toes felt as though they were being held directly over the open flame. She gritted her teeth until her jaw ached, refusing to make a sound. She wouldn't whine. Weakness was leverage, and she had given Orson enough of that to last a lifetime. Will ignored her stoicism. He kept the fire roaring and forced her to drink hot broth made from dried venison. He didn't offer pity. He offered survival. On the morning of the 3rd day, the relentless howling outside finally began to taper off. Carmela managed to push herself up into a sitting position, dragging the heavy wolf furs with her. Her head swam. She looked down at her hands. The angry red swelling had subsided, leaving the skin a mottled, bruised purple. They were stiff, but when she willed her fingers to bend, they obeyed. Will was at the small wooden table in the corner, cleaning a Winchester rifle with a rag that smelled strongly of gun oil. He didn't look up when the bed creaks announced her movement. "Fingers work?" he asked, his voice low, scraping the silence of the room. "Yes." Her voice was still hoarse. "Good. You get to keep 'em. Toes?" She wiggled them experimentally beneath the blankets. The sharp prickle of returning nerves made her wince. "They hurt, but they move," Will nodded, sliding the bolt of the rifle back with a sharp, metallic clack. He laid the weapon across his lap and finally turned his pale grey eyes toward her. "You're lucky, Carmela Rivera. Another 10 minutes out there and we'd be having a different conversation. Or no conversation at all. I know." She swallowed, her throat dry. She looked around the small utilitarian cabin. Traps hung from the rafters. Cured hides were stacked in the corner. It was a place designed solely for existing in a hostile world. "How long does a storm like this usually last?" 3 days, sometimes a week. This one's breaking, wind's dying down." He set the rifle on the table and stood up, filling the small space with his sheer bulk. He walked to the stove, poured a fresh tin of coffee, and brought it to her. Carmela took it, her bruised fingers wrapping around the warm metal. She watched him walk back to his chair. The silence stretched again. It was a heavy, expectant silence. In her experience, men didn't do favors without expecting payment. Orson had taught her that lesson with brutal clarity. He had paid for her train ticket out west, and he had extracted that debt every single day until he decided she was bankrupt. She took a sip of the bitter coffee, steeling herself. "Will," he paused, a block of sharpening stone midway down the blade of his hunting knife. "Yeah." "What do you want?" He looked up, his brow furrowing. "I want to get this blade sharp enough to dress a mule deer. That's not what I mean." Carmela gripped the mug tightly, her knuckles turning white. She forced herself to maintain eye contact, refusing to look away. "I have nothing. No money, no property. The clothes I was wearing are ruined, and even if they weren't, they're barely worth burning. I can't pay you for the food, the shelter, or saving my life." Will set the knife and the stone down on the table. The scrape of metal against wood was loud in the quiet room. He leaned back in his chair, resting his large hands on his thighs. He studied her for a long minute. His expression didn't change, but the atmosphere in the room shifted, growing denser. "You think this is a transaction?" It wasn't a question. "Everything is a transaction!" Carmela replied, her voice laced with a bitter certainty. "I just need to know the terms before I incur any more debt." Will stood up. He didn't move fast, but his size made the simple action imposing. He walked over to the bed, stopping just inches from where she sat clutching the blankets to her chest. He looked down at her, his jaw set. "I live up here because I don't like the rules down in the valley," Will said, his voice a low rumble. "Down there, men trade coins for souls. They weigh a person's worth in gold dust and ledger books. Up here, on my mountain, the only currency is air in your lungs." He reached out. Carmela flinched instinctively, anticipating a blow, a grab, some form of violence. But Will just took the empty tin mug from her trembling hands. "You don't owe me a damn thing, Carmela," he said softly, the harshness fading from his tone, replaced by a weary frustration. "I pulled you out of the snow because you were dying. I fed you because you were starving. You ain't a ledger entry. You're a human being. Stop waiting for the other boot to drop." He turned his back on her and walked to the stove, tossing the mug into a tin basin with a clatter. Carmela sat frozen in the bed. She watched his broad back as he stoked the fire. She wanted to believe him. The sheer, terrifying vulnerability of wanting to believe him almost choked her. But trust was a fragile glass bridge she had shattered long ago. She couldn't walk across it yet. "My clothes are ruined," she stated softly, changing the subject, retreating behind a wall of practicality. Will grunted, closing the iron door of the stove. He walked to a heavy wooden chest at the foot of his own narrow cot on the other side of the room. He threw back the lid, rummaged around for a moment, and pulled out a stack of folded fabric. He tossed it onto the end of her bed. "Flannel shirt, wool trousers, drawstring waist so you can tie 'em tight. Wool socks. They'll swallow you whole, but they're dry and they're warm." He grabbed his heavy fur coat from a peg by the door. "I'm going to check the snare lines. The storm broke enough to see the tree line. Don't go outside." Before she could thank him or argue, he pulled the heavy wooden door open. A blinding shaft of white light pierced the dim cabin, accompanied by a blast of frigid air. The door slammed shut, and he was gone. Silence descended on the cabin the moment Will left. It wasn't the menacing quiet of the blizzard, but a profound, isolating stillness. Carmela waited 10 minutes to ensure he wasn't coming right back. She threw off the heavy furs and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The cold air of the cabin bit into her bare skin, but the residual heat from the fire kept the chill at bay. She stood up. Her legs wobbled, muscles protesting the sudden demand after days of inactivity. But they held her weight. She grabbed the clothes Will had left. He hadn't exaggerated. The flannel shirt fell to her mid-thigh, the sleeves hanging a good foot past her hands. She had to roll them up tightly just to find her fingers. The thick wool trousers were massive. She stepped into them and pulled the coarse rope drawstring as tight as it would go, bunching the heavy fabric around her waist. She folded the hems up to her ankles and pulled on the thick wool socks. She looked ridiculous, a scarecrow drowning in a lumberjack's cast-offs. But she was warm. Carmela moved cautiously around the cabin. Her feet throbbed with a dull ache, but the movement helped chase the stiffness from her joints. She looked at the small living space. It was orderly, but covered in the inevitable grime of mountain living. Ash spilled from the hearth. The tin basin held a stack of greasy plates. A dusting of wood shavings littered the floor near Will's chair. "I don't tolerate dead weight. You eat my food, you take up space." Orson's words echoed in her skull, clear and sharp. The anxiety clawed at her chest. Will said she owed him nothing, but words were cheap. Actions were currency. If she just sat on the bed like a useless invalid, how long until he got tired of feeding her? How long until he looked at her and saw exactly what Orson saw? A burden? She had to be useful. Carmela found a stiff-bristled brush near the basin and began to scrape the hardened grease off the tin plates. The cold water stung her bruised fingers, sending sharp spikes of pain up her forearms, but she ignored it. She scrubbed until the metal shone dull and grey. She stacked them neatly, then moved to the hearth, using a short broom to sweep the scattered ash back into the stone perimeter. She was on her knees, sweeping the wood shavings near Will's chair, when the heavy timber door creaked open. Will stepped inside, bringing a cloud of freezing air with him. He had a brace of snowshoe hares slung over his broad shoulder. He stopped dead in his tracks, snow falling from his boots onto the floorboards. He looked at the clean plates. He looked at the swept hearth. Then he looked down at Carmela, who was frozen on her knees, the small broom clutched in her bruised, swollen hands. His jaw tightened. The grey eyes darkened like a storm front rolling in over the peaks. Carmela scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step back, the oversized trousers pooling around her ankles. "I was just cleaning up, earning my keep." Will dropped the hares onto the small table with a heavy, wet thud. He didn't take off his coat. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. Carmela flinched, shrinking back against the log wall, raising a forearm defensively. He stopped abruptly, 2 feet away. The sight of her flinching seemed to hit him harder than a physical blow. He let out a long, slow breath, a plume of white vapor in the chill air away from the fire. He scrubbed a large, calloused hand over his bearded face. "Put the broom down, Carmela," he said quietly. She didn't move. Her knuckles were white around the wooden handle. "I'm not useless. I can work. I won't be a burden." "Who told you that?" Will asked, his voice completely stripped of its usual gruffness. "The man who locked you out?" Carmela swallowed hard, her throat painfully tight. She nodded once, a jerky, involuntary motion. Will reached out slowly, deliberately broadcasting his movement. He gently took the broom from her rigid grip and tossed it into the corner. He looked down at her hands. They were trembling, the purple skin angry and raw from the cold water. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Carmela lifted her chin, her eyes locking onto his. The fear was still there, a trapped animal scratching at the back of her mind, but Will's gaze held her steady. "You survived a storm that drops full-grown elk," Will said, his tone absolute. "You walked through waist-deep snow in a dress that belongs in a parlor, and you kept moving until your blood literally stopped pumping. You ain't weak, and you sure as hell ain't useless." He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. "You clean because you want a clean room, fine. But don't you ever scrub a plate in my cabin because you think you have to buy your right to breathe the air in it. Understood?" The certainty in his voice cracked something hard and brittle inside her chest. It was a small fracture, but it was there. She had spent a year twisting herself into knots, trying to prove her worth to a man who only saw her as property. Hearing someone acknowledge her resilience, recognizing the sheer hell she had survived, felt like stepping into the sunlight after a month in a root cellar. "Understood," Carmela whispered. Will nodded, his expression turning practical once more. He gestured to the table. "Good. Now sit by the fire and thaw those hands out again. I'm going to skin these hares. We're having stew." Carmela walked to the heavy wooden chair by the hearth and sat down. She pulled the oversized flannel sleeves down over her hands, holding them toward the radiating heat. She watched Will draw his knife and set to work with practiced, efficient strokes. He didn't speak again, and neither did she. But the silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer isolating. It was the quiet of a shared space, a small, warm fortress holding the brutal world at bay. Orson was still down in the valley. The threat of him was a shadow hovering at the edge of her mind. But as she watched the mountain man work, the firelight catching the silver in his dark hair, Carmela realized something profound. For the first time since she boarded that westbound train, she wasn't entirely alone. Morning light finally pierced the frosted window panes on the 4th day. It was a harsh, blinding glare that exposed every crack and splinter of the log cabin. The blizzard had blown itself out, leaving behind a world buried beneath 3 feet of hard-packed powder. Carmela's physical healing was a slow, agonizing crawl. Her fingertips peeled, revealing tender pink skin that burned whenever she touched a warm mug. Her toes throbbed in the oversized wool socks. But she was alive. Will moved with the steady, predictable rhythm of a pendulum. He chopped wood. He checked his trap lines. He skinned game. He rarely spoke unless it was necessary, but the silence between them lost its sharp edges. It became a comfortable void, a space where she didn't have to explain herself, defend herself, or anticipate a sudden outburst of rage. He was a man constructed entirely of hard lines and quiet competence. Carmela watched him from the heavy wooden chair by the hearth. She studied the way he repaired a broken snowshoe with sinew and patience, his large hands moving with surprising dexterity. He never drank whiskey. He never raised his voice. He was the antithesis of the men she had known in the chaotic, cramped saloons down in the valley. "I'm heading down to Ridgeline tomorrow," Will announced one evening. He was greasing his heavy leather boots near the fire. Carmela stiffened. The name of the mining camp hit her like a physical blow. It was only 5 miles away, but it felt like another universe, a universe where Orson lived. "Why?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, her voice tight. Will didn't look up from his work. "Need salt, coffee, ammunition, and you need clothes that don't make you look like a drowned lumberjack?" "I don't need anything." She pulled the massive flannel shirt tighter around herself. The fabric swallowed her, but it was a shield. "I'm fine, don't go." He finally looked up. The firelight caught the silver streaks in his dark beard. "Winter's just starting, Carmela. Once the heavy snows hit next month, the pass closes until April. We stock up now, or we starve in February. Basic arithmetic." "We." The word hung in the air, foreign and terrifying. He was including her in his survival plan. He wasn't kicking her out. "Orson goes to Ridgeline," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "He practically lives in the mercantile and the saloon. If he sees you buying women's clothes, let him see." Will stood up, tossing the grease rag onto the hearth. "I don't hide from men like Orson Horton." "You don't understand," Carmela insisted, her pulse quickening. She stood up, taking a step toward him. "He's not just a bully, he's a liar. He'll have the sheriff convinced I'm a thief. He'll twist it. He always twists it." Will crossed the room in 2 strides. He stopped in front of her, his immense frame blocking out the firelight. He reached behind him to the wooden table, picked up his heavy Colt revolver in its leather holster, and held it out to her. Carmela stared at the weapon. It was massive, the blued steel gleaming dully. "Take it," Will commanded softly. She reached out with hesitant, trembling fingers and gripped the heavy walnut handle. The gun weighed a ton. "I'm leaving at first light," Will said, his grey eyes locked onto hers. "I'll be back before nightfall. You keep the door barred. You keep the fire hot. If anyone tries to open that door who isn't me, you point this at the center of their chest and you pull the trigger. You don't warn them. You don't ask questions. You shoot." Carmela looked down at the gun, then back up at him. "I've never fired a gun." "It's a machine, Carmela. You point, you pull, it does the rest." He reached out and gently adjusted her grip on the handle. His hand was rough, calloused, and incredibly warm against her healing skin. "You aren't helpless. Not anymore. I'll be back. I keep my word." Ridgeline was a scar on the side of the mountain. It was a cluster of canvas tents and hastily erected pine-board buildings clinging to the muddy slopes, smelling of sulfur, wet mule, and stale beer. Will hated the place. He hated the noise. He hated the desperation that hung in the air like fog. But he needed supplies. He tied his pack-horse to the hitching post outside Miller's Mercantile. The cold mud sucked at his boots as he stepped onto the wooden boardwalk. He pushed through the swinging doors, the bell overhead announcing his arrival. The Mercantile was crowded. Miners huddled around a pot-belly stove in the center of the room, swapping lies and warming frozen hands. Will ignored them. He walked straight to the long wooden counter. Silas Miller, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses, looked up from his ledger. He nodded warily. Will Boone wasn't a frequent customer, and when he did come down from the high country, he rarely brought friendly conversation. "Boone," Miller acknowledged. "Winter hit early up your way." "10 pounds of salt," Will said, slapping a heavy tanned beaver pelt onto the counter. 5 pounds of Arbuckle's coffee, 2 boxes of 4440 cartridges, 50 pounds of flour. Miller's eyes widened at the pelt. Prime winter fur. "I can do that. Gonna need a minute to bag the flour." "I need something else." Will kept his voice low, a gravelly murmur beneath the ambient noise of the store. "Boots, women's boots, size 6, and a dress, heavy wool, winter coat to match." Miller stopped writing. He peered over his glasses at Will, his brow furrowing. "Women's clothes? You take a wife up there, Boone?" "Just fetch the items, Miller." Will's tone left no room for further questions. The shopkeeper swallowed hard and scurried away to the back of the store. Will leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. He scanned the room with practiced, cynical eyes. That was when he heard it. A voice carrying from the back corner, near the cracker barrels, a smooth, arrogant tenor. "I'm telling you, the bitch cleaned me out!" Will turned his head fractionally. Orson Horton sat on a flour barrel, a half-empty bottle of rye whiskey in his hand. He was a handsome man, in a sharp, predatory way. Dark hair slicked back with pomade, a well-tailored canvas coat that had never seen a day of hard labor. 3 miners stood around him, listening with rapt attention. "Took $50 in gold eagles right out of my lockbox," Orson lied smoothly, taking a swig from the bottle. "Slipped out right before the storm hit. Sheriff reckoned she tried to make it to the train station at Cheyenne. Probably froze to death in a ditch. Good riddance, I say. You can't trust a city woman. They're all thieves." Will felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. It wasn't anger. Anger was hot and sloppy. This was a precise, calculated rage. He pictured Carmela's waxy, frost-bitten face in the snow. He remembered her flinching away from him when he took the broom out of her hands. He uncrossed his arms. The leather of his coat creaked loudly. One of the miners glanced over, noticing Will's stare. He nudged Orson. Orson stopped talking, his eyes sliding over to the counter. He took in Will's massive frame, the heavy beard, the cold grey eyes. Orson puffed his chest out slightly, projecting a false bravado. "Something I can help you with, mountain man." Orson called out, a sneer twisting his lips. Will didn't blink. He just stared. He memorized the shape of Orson's jaw. He calculated the distance between them. He could draw the hunting knife at his belt and sever the man's vocal cords before the miners could even clear their holsters. It would be easy. It would be satisfying. But Carmela was sitting alone in a cabin 5 miles up a steep trail, terrified and clutching his revolver. If he killed Orson here, in front of witnesses, the sheriff would lock him up. Carmela would starve or freeze, or Orson's friends would find her. Will broke the stare. He turned his back on Orson, dismissing him entirely. It was an insult worse than a punch, and he knew it. He heard Orson scoff loudly behind him, muttering something about wild animals. But Will shut it out. Miller returned, his arms full of wrapped parcels and a pair of sturdy leather lace-up boots. He set them on the counter, his eyes darting nervously between Will and the corner where Orson sat. "That's everything, Boone," Miller said quickly. "The pelt covers it." Will grabbed the parcels. He shoved them into his canvas sack, picked up the sack, and turned toward the door. He didn't look at Orson again as he walked out into the freezing mud. The ride back up the mountain was brutal. The wind picked up, whipping loose snow into his face. But Will pushed the horses hard. The cabin came into view just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow. Smoke curled steadily from the stone chimney. Will tied the horses in the lean-to and walked to the door. He didn't knock. He just kicked the snow off his boots and called out, "It's me." He heard the heavy iron bar scrape back. The door swung open. Carmela stood there. She was holding the heavy Colt revolver with both hands, the barrel pointed directly at his chest. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but her grip was steady. She lowered the gun slowly when she saw his face. Will stepped inside and shut the door behind him, sliding the bolt home. He looked at the gun in her hand, then up at her face. A slow, genuine smile cracked through his thick beard. "Aiming a little high," he noted, dropping the heavy canvas sack onto the table. "Recoil would have put the bullet in the ceiling, but you held the door." "Good." Carmela let out a shaky breath, setting the gun on the table. She looked at the sack. Did you see him?" Will began pulling the parcels out of the bag. He set the heavy wool dress, the thick coat, and the new leather boots on the table. He turned to her, his expression turning serious. "I saw him. I heard him." Will walked over to the hearth and held his cold hands out to the fire. "He's telling the town you stole $50 in gold and ran off into the storm, setting the stage so no one asks questions when spring comes and you don't turn up." Carmela sank into the wooden chair. The color drained from her face completely. "He's making sure I'm a criminal. If I go down there, the sheriff will arrest me. He's trapped me up here." Will turned his back to the fire, looking down at her. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. "He thinks he trapped you," Will corrected, his voice a low, rough rasp that vibrated in the small room. "He thinks you're dead, Carmela, and dead women don't come back down the mountain. But you ain't dead. Put the boots on. We need to see if they fit." She stared at him, bewildered by the sudden shift. "Will, didn't you hear me? I can never go back to town. He's ruined my name." "Your name down there doesn't matter. It's a town of liars and thieves. What matters is right here." He pointed a heavy finger at the floorboards between them. "I told you no one hurts you again. I didn't say it would be easy. Put the damn boots on." Carmela looked at the sturdy, practical leather boots on the table. They weren't elegant. They were built for surviving, just like the man standing in front of her. For the first time, a spark of genuine defiance flared in her chest, pushing back against the icy terror Orson had planted there. She reached out, picked up the left boot, and began to lace it up. Winter locked the mountain in a cage of ice. By December, the snowdrifts reached the lower eaves of the cabin roof. The pass to the valley was impassable, buried under 10 feet of hard-packed powder. Carmela did not merely survive the isolation, she adapted to it. The first few weeks were a battle against her own mind. The silence of the high country was heavy, broken only by the crackling hearth and the timber wolves howling at the frozen moon. But slowly, the anxiety that had defined her life in the valley began to bleed away. There were no drunken shouts outside her window. There was no unpredictable rage waiting for her when she accidentally burned the morning bacon. There was only Will, and Will was a constant. He taught her how to live in his world. He didn't coddle her. When her hands finally healed, leaving the skin tough and slightly scarred, he handed her an axe. "Firewood doesn't chop itself," he had said, pointing to the massive pile of pine logs behind the lean-to. She had struggled at first. The axe was heavy, her swings clumsy and off-balance. She had expected him to sigh in frustration, to snatch the handle from her grip and do it himself, just as Orson would have. But Will simply stood nearby, his thumbs hooked into his belt. "Wider stance," he instructed, his voice cutting through the crisp air. "Don't swing with your arms. Use your shoulders. Let the weight of the iron do the work." When she finally split her first log cleanly in two, the sharp crack echoing off the pines, she looked up, chest heaving. Will didn't smile, but he offered a single, firm nod of approval. It felt better than 1,000 empty compliments. As the weeks turned into months, The cabin became a shared mechanism. Carmela took over the curing of the meat and the mending of their clothes. Will handled the heavy trapping and the perimeter checks. They existed in a quiet rhythm, a synchronized dance of survival. One evening in late January, the wind outside was screaming, rattling the thick window panes. Inside, the heat was absolute. Carmela sat on the edge of her cot, holding the heavy Colt revolver. Will had insisted she learn its mechanics backward and forward. She practiced drawing it from the heavy leather holster, sighting down the barrel at a knot in the pine wall. "You're anticipating the recoil," Will observed from his chair by the fire. He was carving a new handle for a skinning knife. "It kicks like a mule," Carmela replied, keeping the gun raised. "I can't help it." Will set the knife down. He stood up, crossing the small room, his heavy boots silent on the floorboards. He stepped behind her. He didn't crowd her, but the sheer size of him blocked out the draft from the window. The scent of him, wood smoke, cold air, and clean sweat, was a sudden grounding presence. He reached out, placing his large, calloused hand over hers. "You're fighting the machine," he murmured, his voice a low rumble right beside her ear. "You don't fight it, you accept it." He gently adjusted her fingers, loosening her white-knuckled death grip on the walnut handle. His skin was incredibly warm. Carmela felt a sudden, sharp hitch in her breath that had nothing to do with the heavy firearm. "Hold it firm, but don't choke it," Will instructed, his thumb brushing lightly against the sensitive skin of her wrist. "When you pull the trigger, let the recoil travel through your arm, into your shoulder. Don't brace against it like a wall. Absorb it." He stepped back, breaking the contact. The sudden absence of his heat left Carmela feeling strangely exposed. "Try again," he commanded, moving back to his chair. She took a slow breath, steadying her racing pulse. She aimed, remembered the feeling of his hand over hers, and pulled the hammer back with her thumb. Click. She squeezed the trigger. The dry fire clicked loudly in the quiet room. Her hand remained perfectly still. "Better," Will grunted, picking up his carving knife. Carmela lowered the gun, resting it on her lap. She looked across the room at him. The firelight flickered across the harsh lines of his face. He was a dangerous man. A man who could snap Orson Horton's neck without breaking a sweat. Yet, sitting here in the suffocating warmth of the small cabin, she had never felt safer in her entire life. She wasn't a piece of property to him. She wasn't a debt to be collected. "Will," she said, her voice quiet. He didn't look up, but the rhythm of his carving slowed. "Yeah. Why did you stay up here? You could survive anywhere. Why isolate yourself?" Will was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the scrape of the whetstone against steel. "People are complicated," he finally said, his eyes fixed on the blade. "They lie, they cheat. They decide you're one thing, and they refuse to let you be anything else. The mountain doesn't care who you are. It doesn't judge. It just demands respect. You give it respect, it lets you live. I prefer honest terms." He looked up then, meeting her gaze across the firelight. The pale gray of his eyes was intense, stripped of all pretense. "You understand honest terms, Carmela. I see it in you. You didn't break out there in the snow. You just froze. Now you're thawing." Carmela swallowed the lump in her throat. She looked down at her scarred, capable hands. He was right. The woman who had begged on that porch in November was gone. The winter had burned her away, leaving someone else behind. Someone made of harder stuff. Spring arrived not with warmth, but with violence. Ice cracked like rifle fire across the high lakes. The snowpack began to bleed, sending torrents of freezing mud and water roaring down the mountain slopes. The world turned gray and brown, smelling of damp earth and rotting pine needles. By late April, the pass was open. Carmela was hanging washed canvas shirts on a rope line, strung between two massive spruce trees near the lean-to. The air was brisk, but the sun on her face felt like a revelation. She wore the heavy wool trousers and a canvas jacket, a hunting knife strapped to her thigh. She moved with a newly acquired grace, her body toned and hardened by months of labor. Will was half a mile away, checking a snare line near the creek. She had just pinned the last shirt to the line when she heard it, the rhythmic, sucking sound of hooves pulling out of deep mud. Carmela froze. She turned her head slowly toward the trail leading down to ridgeline. A rider broke through the tree line. He was mounted on a large bay gelding, wearing a heavy duster coat coated in dried mud. He held a repeating rifle resting casually across the saddle horn. It was Orson. He looked exactly the same. The same slicked hair, the same arrogant set to his jaw. He was scanning the timber, likely looking for signs of unrecorded logging claims he could steal and sell. He turned his head and saw the cabin. Then he saw her. Orson pulled back on the reins so hard the horse tossed its head in protest. He stared at her, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and sheer disbelief. For a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. The wind rustled the wet pine boughs. "Well, I'll be damned," Orson finally breathed, his voice carrying easily across the clearing. "I thought the coyotes scattered your bones months ago." Carmela didn't run. The urge to flee, the old sickening panic that used to hollow out her stomach, flared for a second, then vanished. It was replaced by a cold, settling calm. She dropped the wooden clothespin in her hand. It hit the mud with a soft thud. She turned fully towards him, her right hand drifting naturally to rest on the leather sheath strapped to her thigh. Orson nudged his horse forward, closing the distance to 20 yards. A cruel, familiar sneer stretched across his face. He looked her up and down, taking in the rough clothes, the knife, the hardened set of her jaw. "You look like hell, Carmela," he mocked. "Playing house with some mountain savage? I told the sheriff you robbed me. He's got a warrant for your arrest sitting on his desk down in the valley." "There's no money, Orson," Carmela said. Her voice was steady. It didn't shake. It shocked her how little fear she felt looking at him now. He wasn't a monster anymore. He was just a small, pathetic man sitting on a horse. "You drank my money. You gambled it away. There's nothing left to steal." Orson's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the tone of her voice. He didn't like that she wasn't cowering. "I say you stole $50. Orson spat, shifting his grip on the rifle across his saddle. "And my word carries weight. You're coming back down with me. You're going to clear my name, and then you're going to pay off what you owe me." He spurred the horse forward, raising the barrel of the Winchester. He didn't make it 2 steps. The crack of a heavy rifle shattered the morning air. Wood and dirt exploded mere inches from the hooves of Orson's horse. The animal screamed, rearing back violently. Orson shouted in panic, dropping his rifle to grab the saddle horn with both hands, fighting to stay mounted. Carmela didn't flinch at the gunshot. She didn't even turn around. Will stepped out from the dense timber on the far side of the clearing. He had his heavy Sharps buffalo rifle raised, the barrel smoking. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, a predator closing in on a trapped animal. His grey eyes were locked on Orson, and they were devoid of any human warmth. It was the look of the blizzard itself. Orson wrestled his horse under control, his face pale and sweating. He looked at the massive man approaching him, then down at his own dropped rifle lying in the mud. He realized instantly that reaching for it was a death sentence. "Boone," Orson stammered, holding his hands up slightly. "This ain't your fight. This woman is a thief. There's a warrant." Will stopped 10 feet away. He lowered the rifle, holding it casually in one hand, but his thumb remained draped over the hammer. "I told her once, no one hurts her again," Will said. The gravel in his voice was so deep it seemed to vibrate the muddy ground. "I don't break my word." "Be reasonable." Orson tried to negotiate. his voice pitching higher. The arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by naked, ugly fear. "She's property. She owes me." Carmela stepped forward. The mud sucked at her heavy boots. She walked past Will, placing herself directly between the mountain man and the horse. Will didn't try to stop her. He just watched her back, a silent, lethal guardian. She looked up at Orson. "I don't owe you a damn thing," Carmela said, her voice ringing clear and hard as struck iron. "You took my money, you took my dignity, and you tried to take my life." She drew the heavy hunting knife from her thigh sheath. The steel glinted harshly in the spring sunlight. "But I survived," she continued, pointing the blade at him. "This mountain is my home now. If you ever come up this pass again, if you ever say my name in that valley again, Will won't shoot the ground next to your horse. And neither will I." Orson stared down at her. He saw the cold, unyielding reality in her eyes. The woman he had broken was dead. The woman standing before him was forged from ice and iron. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing rapidly. He didn't say another word. He yanked the reins hard, hauling the horse around in a tight, panicked circle. He spurred the animal mercilessly, sending chunks of mud flying into the air as he galloped wildly back down the trail toward Ridgeline, leaving his rifle abandoned in the muck. Carmela watched him go until he disappeared into the pines. The sound of the hooves faded, replaced by the rush of the melting creek. She let out a long, shuddering breath and slid the knife back into its sheath. Her hands were shaking, just a little from the adrenaline. Will stepped up beside her. He didn't speak immediately. He reached down and picked up Orson's muddy Winchester. He worked the lever, ejecting the cartridges into the mud, rendering the weapon useless, before tossing it into the brush. He turned to look at her. The lethal coldness in his eyes had melted, replaced by a profound, quiet respect. "He won't be back," Will said softly. Carmela looked up at him. The harsh lines of his face, the silver in his beard, the sheer, immovable presence of him. The relief washing over her was absolute. But it wasn't because he had saved her. It was because he had given her the space to save herself. "I know," Carmela replied, a genuine, hard-won smile touching her lips for the first time in a year. Will reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair away from her face. It was a gesture of startling tenderness from a man made of rough edges. "Come on," he murmured, his thumb lingering on her cheek for a fraction of a second. "Let's go inside. Fire needs stoking." Carmela nodded. They turned their backs on the valley trail and walked side by side toward the cabin, the heavy timber door waiting to welcome them home. Did this harsh winter tale grip your soul? Carmela's journey has only just begun, and the mountain man's promise will face tests harder than any Wyoming blizzard. If you want to see how this brutal, heartwarming romance unfolds, make sure you don't miss the next chapters. Hit that like button if you believe in second chances, share this story with someone who loves gritty Western dramas, and subscribe to the channel for Part 4 and beyond. Ring that notification bell so you're the first to know when the snow clears. Your support keeps these stories alive and helps us bring more wild frontier magic to your screen. Stay warm, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.